To our amazing viewers at Cheating Tales Lab, we'd love to hear, which part of the world are you joining us from? Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Perfect Facade. Edward Mahoney stood on his wraparound porch, watching the sunrise paint the Virginia countryside in shades of gold and amber. At 42, he was a man who had built his life with the same precision he'd once used to dismantle enemy operations in his military days. Everything had its place. Every detail mattered, and weakness was a luxury he'd never been able to afford. The coffee in his hand steamed in the cool morning air as he surveyed the 200-acre property he'd purchased 5 years ago. The main house was a restored colonial that Charlotte had fallen in love with at first sight. She'd spent months decorating it, turning it into something that belonged in a home and garden magazine. The guest house where his mother-in-law Constance Preston lived sat nestled among the oak trees, far enough away to provide privacy, but close enough for the family dinner Charlotte insisted upon. "Dad, you're up early again." Josh Mahoney emerged from the house, his 17-year-old frame already showing the broad shoulders and disciplined posture that came from the martial arts training Edward had insisted upon. The boy moved with quiet confidence, his dark hair still tousled from sleep. "Old habits," Edward replied, his voice carrying the gravelly undertone of a man who'd learned to command respect through presence rather than volume. "Your mother still sleeping?" "Yeah. She was up late on the phone with Aunt Lisa again." Something about the baby's shower decorations. Josh accepted the cup of coffee his father handed him. "Speaking of which, are you actually going to hold the baby this time, or are you going to find another excuse?" Edward's mouth quirked into what might have been a smile on another man's face. On his, it looked more like a calculation. "I've held babies before, son. Just because I don't coo and make faces doesn't mean I'm uncomfortable." "Right, because you treated Kelly and me like tiny soldiers from day one." There was affection in Josh's voice, not complaint. The Mahoney children had learned early that their father's love came in the form of high expectations and unwavering support. When they met them, Kelly Mahoney appeared in the doorway, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun that somehow looked elegant on her 19-year-old face. She'd inherited her mother's beauty, but her father's steel spine. "Are you two having your cryptic father-son bonding time again? Because Mom wants to know if you're wearing the blue shirt or the gray one to the shower." "The gray one," Edward said without hesitation. "Blue makes me look like I'm trying too hard to be approachable." "God forbid anyone think you're human," Kelly teased, but she kissed his cheek as she passed. "I'll tell her. She's already stressed about this thing." Edward watched his daughter disappear back into the house, then turned his attention to the distant tree line where the property bordered the state forest. Something had been bothering him for weeks now, a nagging sensation in the back of his mind that he couldn't quite identify. In his previous life, the one that officially didn't exist according to government records, that feeling had kept him alive on 3 continents. It was a sense that something in his environment had changed, something that didn't belong. Charlotte had been different lately. Subtle changes that most husbands might attribute to stress were the natural evolution of a 15-year marriage. But Edward wasn't most husbands. He'd built his fortune in private security consultation precisely because he noticed what others missed. The way she held her phone differently, how she'd started taking calls in another room, the new perfume that appeared in their bathroom without explanation. "You're doing that thing again," Josh observed. "What thing?" "That thing where you look like you're planning someone's demise." Edward's laugh was a low rumble. "Maybe I am." The truth was, Edward Mahoney had never been a trusting man. Even before Charlotte, even before the kids, even before the military taught him, that paranoia was just another word for preparation. His childhood in the project of Baltimore had been a masterclass in survival, where showing weakness invited predators, and trust was a currency you couldn't afford to spend carelessly. His parents, Miguel and Rosa Burgess. He'd taken Mahoney from his stepfather who'd adopted him at 16, had worked 3 jobs between them just to keep food on the table. Edward had learned early that if you wanted something, you took it. If someone threatened what was yours, you eliminated the threat. It was a philosophy that served him well in special operations, where he'd earned a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in completing objectives. When he'd met Charlotte at a charity gala in D.C. 12 years ago, she'd been everything he wasn't Graceful, trusting, raised in the kind of privileged Virginia family where the worst thing that happened was when the country club ran out of decent champagne. She'd been drawn to his intensity, and he'd been fascinated by her innocence. It had seemed like a perfect balance. Now, watching the morning mist rise in the pastures where their horses grazed, Edward wondered if that balance had been an illusion. "Dad," Josh said quietly, "are you and Mom okay?" The question hung in the air like the morning fog. Edward turned to study his son's face, seeing his own gray eyes reflected back at him. Josh had always been perceptive, more so than Kelly, who preferred to see the world as she wanted it to be rather than as it was. "Why do you ask?" "I don't know. Things feel different. Mom's been weird. You've been quieter than usual, which is saying something. And yesterday I heard you on the phone with Uncle Aaron, and you only call him when you need information on someone." Aaron Bender was Edward's former team leader, now running a private investigation firm in Richmond. If Josh had overheard that conversation, the boy was more observant than Edward had given him credit for. "Sometimes marriages go through rough patches," Edward said carefully. "It doesn't mean anything you need to worry about." But even as he said it, Edward knew that wasn't entirely true, because if his suspicions were correct, if Charlotte was doing what every instinct told him she was doing, then rough patch didn't begin to describe what was coming. The sound of gravel crunching under tires announced Charlotte's return from her morning run. She jogged up the driveway. Her blonde hair darkened with sweat, her breathing controlled despite the 5-mile circuit she'd just completed. At 38, she was still stunning, the kind of woman who turned heads in restaurants and made other wives unconsciously stand straighter. "Morning, boys," she called out, climbing the porch steps with the easy grace that had first caught Edward's attention all those years ago. She kissed Josh's forehead, then stood on her toes to kiss Edward's cheek. Her lips lingered a fraction longer than usual, and her perfume, that new perfume, filled his nostrils. "Good run?" Edward asked. "Great. I love these morning routes. So peaceful, you know? Just me and the road and my thoughts." She squeezed his arm. "I'm going to shower and then start getting ready for Lisa's thing. You haven't forgotten, have you?" "Gray shirt," Edward confirmed. "Perfect. I think you'll like the venue." Lisa picked this beautiful estate outside Charlottesville. Very private, very elegant. The kind of place where you can really relax and enjoy yourself. Something in the way she said very private made the feeling in Edward's gut twist tighter. But he simply nodded and watched her disappear into the house, her running shoes silent on the hardwood floors. Josh was studying him again. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Always." "If someone betrayed you, really betrayed you, would you forgive them?" The question was so unexpected that Edward felt his carefully maintained composure slip for just an instant. In that moment, his son got a glimpse of the man who had earned the nickname the surgeon in certain classified circles, the man who approached problems with surgical precision and absolute finality. "No," Edward said quietly. "I don't believe in forgiveness, Josh. I believe in consequences." As they stood there in the morning silence, neither of them could have known how prophetic those words would prove to be. Chapter 2, Fractures in Paradise. The drive to Charlottesville should have been pleasant. Charlotte sat in the passenger seat of Edward's black Tahoe, her hand resting on his thigh as she chatted about the baby shower preparations. Kelly occupied the middle row, scrolling through her phone and occasionally contributing to the conversation with the casual disinterest of a teenager forced to attend a family function. Josh had opted to stay home, claiming he had college prep work to do, though Edward suspected his son simply had no desire to spend his Saturday surrounded by women cooing over baby clothes. "Lisa's been so stressed about everything being perfect," Charlotte was saying, her manicured fingers tracing patterns on Edward's jeans. "You know how she gets. She wants this to be special for her and Miguel." Edward grunted noncommittally. His sister Lisa Dow had married Miguel Burgess, Edward's biological father, 3 years ago, a union that had surprised everyone given the 20-year age gap. But Miguel had cleaned up his act, built a successful landscaping business, and Lisa seemed genuinely happy. At 35, she thought her chance for children had passed. So this pregnancy was something she'd been planning for with military precision. "The guest list is pretty small," Charlotte continued. Just family and a few close friends. Very intimate. Who's she inviting from her side? Edward asked, though he wasn't sure why the question had popped into his head. Charlotte's hand stilled for just a moment. Oh, the usual. Some of her college friends. A few people from work. Clay Dillon's going to be there. You remember Clay, right? He's the one who helped with the renovation planning when Lisa was fixing up her house. Edward did remember Clay Dillon. Tall, blonde. The kind of man who smiled too much and talked too fast. He'd struck Edward as the type who was used to getting what he wanted through charm rather than effort. The few times they'd met, Clay had tried that charm on Edward and seemed frustrated when it failed to have any effect. Interesting that he'd come to a baby shower, Kelly observed from the back seat. Seems like more of a girl's thing. Oh, Clay's very supportive, Charlotte said quickly. He's been helping Lisa with a lot of the planning. He has excellent taste in these sorts of things. Edward felt that familiar twist in his gut again. Something about his wife's tone when she said Clay's name. Too casual, too carefully neutral. He'd heard that same tone from subjects during interrogations when they were trying to hide something without outright lying. The estate Lisa had chosen was indeed beautiful. Set on 100 acres of rolling hills, the main house was an antebellum mansion that had been converted into an event venue. Cars were already parked in the circular drive when they arrived, and Edward could see guests mingling on the expansive back lawn under white party tents. Oh, this is gorgeous, Charlotte breathed, squeezing Edward's hand. Lisa really outdid herself. They made their way around the back of the house, where the party was in full swing. Lisa spotted them immediately and hurried over, her pregnant belly prominent under a flowing blue dress. She hugged Charlotte first, then Kelly, and finally threw her arms around Edward with the easy affection of someone who'd earned the right to touch him without permission. Eddie, I'm so glad you came, she said, using the childhood nickname that only she was allowed to use. You look good. Very intimidating in that gray shirt. That was the goal, Edward replied, allowing himself a genuine smile. Lisa was one of the few people in the world who could bring out his softer side. She'd been there during the worst years of his childhood, had stood by him when he'd made mistakes, and had never once asked him to be anything other than exactly who he was. Come on, let me introduce you to everyone, Lisa said, linking her arm through his, though I think you know most of the faces. As they moved through the crowd, Edward cataloged the guests with the automatic precision of someone trained to assess threats. Most were indeed familiar. Family friends, colleagues of Lisa's from the design firm where she worked, a few neighbors. But his attention kept drifting to Clay Dillon, who was holding court near the gift table with what appeared to be an amusing story about interior design disasters. Clay was exactly as Edward remembered. 6'2", blonde hair styled with the kind of casual perfection that took significant effort to achieve, wearing a polo shirt and khakis like he'd stepped out of a country club catalog. But what struck Edward most was how Charlotte kept glancing in Clay's direction, quick looks that she thought no one would notice. Eddie, Lisa said quietly, following his gaze, is everything okay? You look like you're planning someone's funeral. Just taking in the scenery, Edward replied. The next hour passed in the usual rhythm of such gatherings. Edward made polite conversation, accepted a beer he didn't drink, and watched his wife work the crowd with the social grace that came from her privileged upbringing. Charlotte McKinney had been born to this world of garden parties and charity galas, while Edward had learned to navigate it as a matter of survival. It was during the gift-opening ceremony that Edward noticed the text. Charlotte was sitting beside him on one of the white folding chairs arranged in a semicircle around Lisa, her phone resting in her lap. When it buzzed an incoming message, she glanced down and Edward caught a glimpse of the screen. The contact name read CD and the message preview showed, "You look beautiful today." Edward's training had taught him to control his reactions, so his face betrayed nothing. But inside, something cold and sharp settled in his chest. CD could only be Clay Dillon, and there was no innocent reason for another man to be texting his wife about how beautiful she looked while sitting 10 feet away from her husband. Charlotte quickly deleted the message and slipped the phone into her purse, but not before Edward saw her small smile. The same secret smile she used to give him when they were first dating, and he'd send her romantic messages during meetings. "Eddie, Lisa was holding up a tiny blue onesie. What do you think of this one? Very blue, Edward said automatically, his mind elsewhere. The gift opening continued, but Edward was no longer paying attention to the baby clothes and nursery decorations. Instead, he was watching his wife and Clay Dillon with the focused intensity of a predator studying its prey. The glances, the careful distance they maintained, the way Charlotte's laugh became slightly higher when Clay told a joke. It all painted a picture that Edward recognized with crystalline clarity. When it came time to hold the baby, Edward found himself hesitating. Lisa's neighbor had brought her 6-month-old son, and the guests were taking turns passing him around. As the bundle of blankets and soft gurgles made its way toward Edward, Charlotte suddenly grabbed his arm. "Take the kids and leave now," she whispered urgently, her fingers digging into his bicep with surprising strength. Edward turned to stare at his wife. Her usual composure was completely gone, replaced by something that looked like panic. Her face had gone pale, and there was a tremor in her voice he'd never heard before. "What?" Edward said quietly. No time to explain. Charlotte's eyes were darting around the party, like she was looking for escape routes. "Just take Kelly and go." "Please, Edward. Trust me." For a moment, Edward was completely off balance. In 15 years of marriage, Charlotte had never looked at him like this, like she was terrified of something she couldn't name. His first instinct was to demand answers, to pin her down until she explained what had her so spooked. But then his training kicked in, the same instincts that had kept him alive in hostile territory. When your partner says run, you run. Questions come later. "Kelly," Edward called out, his voice carrying enough authority to cut through the party chatter. "We're leaving." His daughter looked up from the gift table, where she'd been helping with ribbon duty. "Now!" "But we just got here." "Now!" Something in Edward's tone made Kelly's protest die in her throat. She gathered her purse and followed him toward the house without another word. As they reached the circular drive, Edward turned back to see Charlotte still sitting among the other guests, but her eyes were fixed on him with an expression he couldn't read. The drive home was tense. Kelly peppered him with questions that Edward couldn't answer because he didn't understand what had just happened. All he knew was that his wife had looked genuinely terrified and had sent him away like she was trying to protect him from something, or protect herself. When they pulled into their driveway 20 minutes later, Josh met them at the door with a concerned expression. "You're back early," he observed. "How was the shower?" "Ask your mother when she gets home," Edward said grimly. "I need to make some calls." He went to the study and closed the door, then pulled out his phone and dialed Aaron Bender's number. His former team leader answered on the second ring. "Eddie, how'd the baby shower go?" "I need you to accelerate that background check we discussed," Edward said without preamble. "On your wife?" "Eddie, I thought you said this was just being cautious." "It's not cautious anymore, and I need you to add someone else to the list. Clay Dillon, works in interior design, probably lives in the Richmond area." There was a pause. "What happened?" Edward stared out the window at the peaceful Virginia countryside, where nothing had changed but everything felt different. "I think my wife just warned me about something she's involved in," he said quietly, "and I need to know what it is before she comes home." Chapter 3. The Television Confession. Edward paced his study like a caged predator. His phone pressed to his ear as Aaron Bender's voice crackled through the speaker. "I can have preliminary information on Dillon within 2 hours, Aaron was saying. "But Edward, if you're right about this, you need to think carefully about what you're going to do with the information." "Just get it to me," Edward replied, his voice carrying a flat tone that had once made enemy combatants reconsider their life choices. "Everything. Financial records, social media, where he buys his coffee. I want to know what brand of toothpaste he uses. And your wife." Edward stopped pacing and stared out the window at the guest house where his mother-in-law lived. Constance Preston's car was gone, which meant she'd probably driven to the baby's shower after they'd left. The irony wasn't lost on him that he might be about to destroy the family that woman had worked so hard to integrate him into. Charlotte, too. Full deep dive. Bank records, phone records, travel history. If she's been cheating, there will be evidence. "Eddie, listen to me." Aaron's voice carried the weight of 20 years of friendship. You're talking about going nuclear on your family based on a text message and a feeling. Maybe there's an explanation. There's always an explanation, Aaron. The question is whether it's the truth. After Edward hung up, he sat in his leather chair and forced himself to think like the operative he'd once been rather than the husband he currently was. Strip away emotion, focus on facts, analyze patterns. Charlotte's behavior over the past 3 months began to take on a different shape when viewed through that lens. The new perfume, the phone calls taken in private, the way she'd started working out more, paying attention to her appearance with the kind of focus that suggested she was trying to impress someone, the evening errands that seemed to take longer than necessary, the subtle changes in her intimacy, not less frequent, but different somehow, like she was performing rather than participating. A knock on the study door interrupted his analysis. "Dad." Kelly's voice was muffled through the heavy oak. "Josh and I are ordering pizza. Do you want anything?" "I'm fine," Edward called back. But he wasn't fine. He was the opposite of fine. He was experiencing the peculiar sensation of watching his carefully constructed life develop fault lines that might bring the whole structure crashing down. His phone buzzed with a text from Charlotte. "Emergency at the party. Staying to help Lisa. Home later. Love you." Edward stared at the message for a long moment. In 15 years of marriage, Charlotte had never once used the word emergency in casual conversation. She was the type of woman who described natural disasters as challenging weather situations and called car accidents minor transportation incidents. The use of such a strong word felt deliberate, like a signal. But a signal of what? The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. Edward tried to focus on work emails, then on a book, then on reorganizing his gun safe. But nothing could distract him from the growing certainty that his world was about to change dramatically. Josh and Kelly seemed to sense his mood and gave him space, occasionally checking on him but mostly staying out of his way. At 6:30, Edward's phone rang. Aaron's name appeared on the screen. "That was fast," Edward said by way of greeting. "That's because this was easier than I expected," Aaron replied, and something in his voice made Edward's stomach clench. "Eddie, you need to sit down." "I'm sitting." Clay Dillon isn't an interior designer. He's a photographer. Specifically, he specializes in what he calls artistic intimate portraits for wealthy clients. His studio is in an industrial district in Richmond, and according to his financial records, he's been making house calls to very exclusive clientele. Edward felt the pieces clicking into place with mathematical precision. House calls. 3 times a week for the past 2 months. He'd been paid $500 cash for private sessions at various high-end locations. Hotels, estates, private residences. Always the same duration. 2 hours. Always the same payment method. And Charlotte. Her credit card records show regular charges at a boutique hotel in Richmond on the same days and times as Dillon's appointments. Room service orders for 2, champagne, the works. She's been paying for these trysts like they're business meetings. Edward closed his eyes and felt something cold and final settle in his chest. How long? Based on the pattern? 3 months, maybe 4. Eddie, I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. But that was where Aaron was wrong. In a strange way, this was exactly what Edward had wanted to hear. Not because he enjoyed being betrayed, but because uncertainty was a kind of torture that certainty could end. Now he knew. Now he could act. "There's more," Aaron continued. "Dillon's got a reputation in certain circles. Wealthy, bored wives looking for excitement, art, and adventure. He's very good at making them feel sophisticated and desired. Some of his previous clients ended up leaving their husbands. Is that his end game? Hard to say. But he's never stayed with any of them long term. It seems like he enjoys the chase more than the catch." Edward thanked Aaron and hung up, then sat in the growing darkness of his study as the full scope of his wife's betrayal crystallized in his mind. This wasn't a moment of weakness or marriage going through a rough patch. This was a calculated affair with a man who specialized in seducing married women. The sound of gravel in the driveway announced Charlotte's return. Edward checked his watch. 8:15. The baby shower had officially ended at 5. He remained in his study as he heard Charlotte enter the house, call out greetings to the kids, and move around the kitchen preparing what sounded like a late dinner. When she finally knocked on his door at 9 o'clock, Edward had used the time to make several more phone calls and begin formulating a plan. "Edward, can I come in? It's open." Charlotte entered carrying a plate of leftover baby shower food and a glass of wine. She'd changed out of her party dress into yoga pants and one of his old military t-shirts, the kind of casual intimacy that had once made him feel like the luckiest man alive. "You missed an interesting afternoon," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. There was some drama with the catering, and then Lisa started having contractions, but it turned out to be false labor. Clay was actually really helpful. He drove her to hospital while Miguel was having a panic attack. The lie came so easily that Edward almost admired the skill. If he hadn't already known the truth, he might have believed the concern in her voice, the way she casually mentioned Clay as if he were just another helpful guest rather than the man she'd been sleeping with for months. "How considerate of him," Edward said. "You know, I think I misjudged him before. He's actually really sweet when you get to know him. Very artistic, very sensitive." Charlotte took a sip of wine and studied Edward's face. "Are you okay? You seem tense." "Just tired. It's been a long day." Charlotte set down her wine glass and moved around the desk to perch on the arm of his chair. Her hand found the back of his neck, fingers working at the tight muscles there with practiced ease. "Maybe we should go to bed early tonight," she murmured, her lips brushing his ear. "It feels like it's been forever since we had time just for us." Edward allowed her to touch him, even as every instinct screamed at him to pull away. But showing his hand now would be a tactical error. Better to let her think she was still successfully deceiving him while he planned his next move. "That sounds good," he said, turning to kiss her palm. "But first, I want to catch the news. There was supposed to be something interesting on tonight." Charlotte stiffened almost imperceptibly. "The news? Since when do you watch the local news?" "Since Aaron mentioned there might be something worth seeing." Edward reached for the remote and turned on the television mounted on his study wall. "Channel 12, I think," he said. As the local news program began, Edward watched his wife's reflection in the dark window behind the television. Charlotte's face had gone pale again, the same expression of barely controlled panic she'd worn at the baby's shower. The lead story was about a house fire in Richmond. The second story covered a city council meeting. The third story made Charlotte's wine glass slip from her nerveless fingers. Tonight, Channel 12 News has obtained exclusive footage that appears to show several prominent Richmond area residents engaged in what can only be described as compromising situations, the anchor was saying. The footage was allegedly taken by photographer Clay Dillon at various locations throughout the metropolitan area over the past several months. Edward felt Charlotte go rigid beside him. On the screen, a grainy but clearly recognizable video showed Clay Dillon's photography studio, with several women entering and leaving. The news report was careful not to show faces, but Edward didn't need to see faces to recognize his wife's car in the parking lot, or her distinctive blonde hair as she hurried toward the building. The footage was anonymously delivered to the station earlier today. The anchor continued, along with documentation suggesting that Mr. Dillon has been blackmailing several of his subjects. Police have issued a warrant for his arrest, and several other individuals are expected to be charged in connection with this ongoing investigation. Charlotte stood up so quickly that she knocked over her chair. "Edward, I can explain." But Edward was no longer listening to his wife. He was watching the screen, where a breaking news banner had appeared. In carefully neutral language, the reporter was describing how an anonymous tipster had provided law enforcement with evidence of an extensive blackmail operation targeting wealthy married women in the Richmond area. What the reporter didn't say, what couldn't be said on television, was that Edward Mahoney had spent the past 4 hours methodically destroying Clay Dillon's life. Aaron Bender's investigation had revealed not just the affair, but Dillon's entire modus operandi. The photographer wasn't just seducing married women. He was documenting their encounters and using the evidence to extort money from them. Edward had simply given law enforcement everything they needed to take Dillon down, along with enough anonymous tips to ensure the story would dominate the local news cycle for weeks. The anonymous tipster also provided the station with evidence suggesting that several of the women involved may have been willing participants in the alleged scheme. The reporter continued. Our legal experts suggest that charges of conspiracy and fraud are likely to follow. Edward turned to look at his wife, who was standing frozen in the middle of his study like a deer caught in headlights. In the space of 10 minutes, her secret life had been exposed to the entire Richmond metropolitan area. Her affair was over, her lover was facing criminal charges, and she was likely to be arrested as a co-conspirator. Sit down, Charlotte, Edward said quietly. Edward, please, you have to understand. Sit down. The command in his voice made her sink back into her chair. For the first time in their marriage, Charlotte McKinney was seeing her husband as the people who had feared him in his previous life had seen him. Cold, calculating, and absolutely implacable. Now, Edward said, muting the television but leaving the images of police cars outside Clay Dillon's studio playing silently on the screen. Let's discuss what happens next. Chapter 4. The Unraveling. Charlotte's hands shook as she gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles white against the dark leather. The television continued its silent broadcast behind Edward, the flashing lights of police cars painting intermittent shadows across his face. To Charlotte, he looked like a stranger, not the man who had held her hair when she was sick or who had cried when Kelly took her first steps, but something colder and infinitely more dangerous. How long have you known? She whispered. Edward leaned back in his chair, his gray eyes studying her with the clinical detachment of an entomologist examining a particularly interesting specimen. I suspected for weeks. I've known with certainty for about 4 hours. Then you did this. You destroyed Clay. Clay destroyed himself the moment he decided to blackmail married women. Edward's voice was conversational, almost pleasant. I simply provided law enforcement with evidence of crimes that were already in progress. Charlotte's face crumpled as the full scope of her situation became clear. The police, they're going to arrest me, aren't they? Probably. Aaron's sources suggest they're building cases against at least 6 women who were involved with Dillon. Your financial records show you paid him nearly $15,000 over the past 3 months, ostensibly for photography services that never produced any legitimate artwork. Those weren't payment for blackmail, Charlotte said desperately. They were gifts. I cared about him. Edward, this wasn't some sordid. Don't. The single word cut through her explanation like a blade. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this was a romance. Dillon has done this exact thing to 7 other women in the past 2 years. You weren't special, Charlotte. You were just another mark. The words hit Charlotte like physical blows. She doubled over in her chair, her breath coming in short gasps. I never meant for it to happen. It started innocently, just coffee after he helped Lisa with her house. He made me feel young again, interesting, like I was more than just someone's wife and mother. And that justifies betraying our marriage, betraying our children. You don't understand what it's like. Charlotte shot back, anger momentarily overpowering her fear. You're so controlled, so perfect at everything you do. Do you have any idea what it's like to live with someone who never shows weakness, never needs anything, never seems to actually need me? Edward's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. So this is my fault. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that I felt invisible in my own life. Clay saw me, really saw me, in a way that you haven't in years. Clay saw an easy target, Edward corrected. A wealthy, lonely woman with access to money and a marriage she was willing to risk. That's not the same thing as being seen. Charlotte stared at her husband, and for the first time in their marriage, she recognized that she was looking at someone she didn't really know. The gentle man who had proposed to her on Virginia Beach, who had held her hand during her difficult pregnancies, who had never once raised his voice to her in 15 years. That man was still there, but underneath was someone capable of orchestrating another person's complete destruction with surgical precision. What happens now? She asked. Edward was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled in front of him. Now you make a choice. You can call a lawyer, prepare for the inevitable charges, and fight this through the courts while our children watch their mother become a public scandal. Or or you disappear." The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Charlotte's eyes widened as she processed what he was suggesting. "You want me to run?" "I want you gone," Edward said simply. "Tonight, before the police connect all the dots and show up here with an arrest warrant. Before Josh and Kelly have to watch their mother being handcuffed on the evening news." "Edward, you can't be serious. This is my home, my life. These are my children." "Your children are going to be devastated enough when they learn what their mother has been doing. They don't need to watch you be arrested for conspiracy and fraud." Charlotte stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out at the property she'd spent years making into a home. "Where would I even go? I don't have anywhere. That's not my problem anymore." The finality in his voice made her turn around. "After 15 years, that's it? You just want me gone? What did you expect, Charlotte? Did you think I'd forgive you? Take you back? Pretend this never happened?" Edward's voice remained calm, but there was something underneath it now. Something that made Charlotte take an involuntary step backward. "I don't forgive betrayal. Ever. The children need their mother. The children need stability. They need to be able to trust the people in their lives. You destroyed that the moment you started sleeping with Clay Dillon." Charlotte's composure finally cracked completely. She sank to her knees in the middle of the study, tears streaming down her face as the weight of what she'd lost crashed over her. "Please, Edward. I'll do anything. I'll go to counseling. I'll never see Clay again. I'll spend the rest of my life making this up to you. Stand up." The command was quiet but unmistakable. Charlotte struggled to her feet, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm going to give you 1 hour," Edward said. "Take whatever you can carry and leave. Your credit cards will be canceled by morning, so take whatever cash you have. Your car is in your name, so you can drive it, but I'd suggest getting rid of it quickly since it will be easy to trace." 1 hour? Charlotte's voice was barely a whisper. 58 minutes now. "And Charlotte, when you leave, you don't come back. You don't contact the children. You don't try to explain or justify or win them back. As far as they're concerned, their mother made a choice that destroyed this family, and that choice has consequences. They'll hate you for keeping me away from them." Edward's smile was the coldest thing Charlotte had ever seen. "They'll hate you for leaving. There's a difference." Upstairs, Charlotte moved through their bedroom like a sleepwalker, mechanically packing clothes into a suitcase while Edward watched from the doorway. She paused at the dresser where family photos were arranged in silver frames. Their wedding day, the kids' graduations, family vacations of places that now seemed like they belonged to someone else's life. "Can I?" She started to reach for a photo of Josh and Kelly. "No." Charlotte's hand dropped to her side. She finished packing in silence, then stood in the middle of the bedroom that had been hers for 8 years. "What will you tell them?" "The truth, that their mother had an affair and chose to leave rather than face the consequences." "That's not the truth." "Isn't it?" Edward stepped aside as she wheeled her suitcase toward the door. "You made a choice 3 months ago to betray this family. You're making another choice now to abandon it rather than fight for it. What part of that isn't true?" They walked downstairs together in silence. In the foyer, Charlotte paused with her hand on the doorknob. "The children I love." "Don't." Edward's voice cut her off again. "Don't tell me what you love. If you had loved them, you wouldn't have risked losing them for Clay Dillon." Charlotte opened the door and stepped into the cool Virginia night. The crickets were singing in the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a dog was barking. Normal sounds of a normal evening in a normal life that was ending. "Edward," she said without turning around, "I really am sorry." "I know you are," Edward replied, "but sorry doesn't fix what's broken." Charlotte walked to her car without looking back. Edward stood in the doorway and watched her drive away, her taillights disappearing around the curve in their long driveway. When the sound of her engine faded, he closed the door and locked it. In the kitchen, he found Josh and Kelly sitting at the breakfast bar with half-eaten plates of pizza, their faces carefully neutral in the way children learn when they've overheard adult conversations they're not supposed to hear. "Where's Mom going?" Kelly asked quietly. Edward looked at his children. He realized, not theirs anymore, and felt something settle in his chest that might have been relief or might have been grief. "Sit down," he said. "We need to talk." Chapter 5, Damage Assessment. The next morning brought reporters. Edward discovered them when he stepped onto his porch at 6 a.m. for his usual coffee ritual. 3 news vans were parked along the road at the edge of his property. Their satellite dishes extended like mechanical flowers reaching for the sky. Camera crews lounged against their vehicles, smoking cigarettes and checking their equipment while they waited for something newsworthy to happen. Mr. Mahoney, a blonde reporter in a red blazer, started jogging toward his house the moment she spotted him. "Could we get a statement about your wife's involvement with Clay Dillon?" Edward studied the approaching pack of journalists with the same detached interest he might show a pack of wolves. Behind the blonde reporter, camera operators were hefting their equipment and following her wake, hoping to capture whatever reaction they could provoke. He set his coffee cup on the porch railing and walked to the edge of his property, where a decorative iron fence marked the boundary between his land and the public road. The reporters clustered on the other side, like children pressing against zoo barriers. "Good morning," Edward said pleasantly. "Mr. Mahoney, are you aware that your wife Charlotte is wanted for questioning in connection with the Clay Dillon blackmail scandal?" The blonde reporter thrust a microphone toward him while her cameraman focused his lens. "I'm aware that my wife left last night," Edward replied. "Beyond that, I have no comment. Do you know where she went?" "No. Are you planning to stand by her through this investigation?" Edward considered the question for a moment, then smiled the same cold smile that made Charlotte flinch the night before. "My wife made her choices. Now she gets to live with the consequences." The reporters exchanged glances. This wasn't the response they'd been expecting from a loyal husband defending his family. "Sir, some sources suggest that you might have been the anonymous tipster who provided evidence against Mr. Dillon," called out a male reporter from the back of the group. "Sources say a lot of things," Edward replied. "Most of them are wrong." He turned and walked back to his house without another word, leaving the reporters to shout additional questions at his retreating figure. From the kitchen window, he could see Josh and Kelly watching the spectacle with expressions of mortification and confusion. "Dad," Kelly said as he entered the house, "what's going on? Why are there news crews in our front yard?" Edward poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and considered how much truth his children were ready to handle. At 19 and 17, they were old enough to understand the basic facts, but young enough that the details might damage them in ways that wouldn't heal easily. "Your mother was having an affair," he said simply. "The man she was involved with has been arrested for blackmail. The media thinks there's a story here." Josh set down his orange juice with careful precision. "How long did you know?" "I suspected for a while. I confirmed it yesterday." "Is that why she left?" Kelly's voice was small, younger than her 19 years. "She left because she didn't want to face the consequences of her actions." Kelly stared at him for a long moment. "Are you okay, Dad?" Edward felt something twist in his chest at the question. His daughter was worried about him, even as her own world was falling apart. "I'm fine, sweetheart. What I need to know is whether you two are going to be okay." "Define okay," Josh said dryly. "Because if okay means pretending our mother didn't just blow up our family for some random guy, then no, I don't think it would be okay." Edward studied his son's face, seeing his own features reflected back, but tempered with Charlotte's softer lines. Josh had always been the more analytical of his children, the one who processed emotions through logic rather than feeling. Right now, that trait was probably serving him well. "Your mother made a mistake," Edward said carefully. "But that doesn't mean our family is destroyed. It just means it's different now." "Different how?" Kelly asked. "Smaller." The word hung in the air between them. Edward watched his children process the implications, that their mother wasn't coming back, that their family structure had permanently changed, that the life they'd known was over. Can we call her?" Kelly asked hesitantly. "She won't answer," Edward replied. "And even if she did, what would you say? That you forgive her? That you want her to come home and pretend this never happened?" Kelly's eyes filled with tears. "Maybe. Then you'd be enabling her to hurt you again." It was Josh who asked the question Edward had been expecting. "Did you make her leave?" Edward met his son's eyes steadily. I gave her a choice. She could stay and face the consequences of her actions, or she could leave before those consequences caught up with her. She chose to leave. But you knew she'd leave, Josh pressed. You knew Mom wouldn't want to deal with the scandal and the police and all the rest of it. Yes, Edward admitted. I knew she'd run. So you basically forced her out without actually forcing her out. Edward felt a flash of pride at his son's perceptiveness, even under these circumstances. That's one way to look at it. What's another way? That I protected this family from having to watch her be arrested on our front lawn. The phone rang before either of his children could respond. Edward glanced at the caller ID and saw Aaron Bender's name. I need to take this, he said, stepping into his study. Eddie, we have a problem, Aaron said without preamble. Clay, Dylan posted bail an hour ago. Edward felt his hand tighten on the phone. How is that possible? You said they had solid evidence. They do, but apparently Dylan's family has money, and his lawyer convinced a judge that he's not a flight risk. He's out pending trial. Where is he now? Unknown. He left the courthouse in a black Mercedes that's registered to a law firm in D.C. Eddie, you need to be careful. If Dylan figures out that you were behind the evidence dump, he might come looking for payback. Edward walked to his window and looked out at the reporters still camped on his property line. Let him come. I'm serious. This guy has already shown he's willing to manipulate and blackmail people. He might not stop at legal revenge. Aaron, Clay Dillon spent 3 months seducing my wife and documenting their encounters. He used those images to extort money from her and God knows how many other women. If he wants to escalate this beyond the legal system, that's his choice. And if he comes after your kids? Edward's voice went flat and cold. Then Clay Dillon will discover why my former colleagues call me the surgeon. After Edward hung up, he stood at his window for several minutes, watching the reporters and thinking about the conversation. Aaron was right to be concerned. Men like Clay Dillon didn't accept defeat gracefully, especially when that defeat was as public and humiliating as the one Edward had orchestrated. But Edward had been dealing with dangerous men for most of his adult life. The difference between Clay Dillon and the enemies he'd faced in his military days was that Dillon was a predator who specialized in targeting the vulnerable. Edward was the opposite, a predator who specialized in targeting other predators. If Dillon wanted a war, Edward would give him one, but it would be a war fought on Edward's terms, according to Edward's rules, with Edward's choice of weapons. And Edward Mahoney had never lost a war. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Your wife says hello. Edward stared at the message for a moment, then showed it to Aaron when his former team leader called back 5 minutes later. Well, Aaron said after Edward read him the text, I guess we know Dillon figured out who was behind his arrest. Good, Edward replied. That saves me the trouble of introducing myself. Eddie, listen to me. You're not active duty anymore. You can't just disappear this guy. I'm not going to disappear him, Aaron. I'm going to destroy him so completely that he'll wish I had. Edward hung up and returned to the kitchen, where his children were still sitting in stunned silence. The morning sun was streaming to the windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that reminded him of better times. Dad, Kelly said quietly, are we going to be okay? Edward looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw a strength there that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with Charlotte in the first place. But unlike her mother, Kelly had inherited Edward's steel spine along with Charlotte's beauty. We're going to be better than okay, he told her. We're going to be stronger. Outside, the reporters were settling in for what looked like a long siege. Edward's phone was ringing with calls from numbers he didn't recognize, probably more journalists looking for quotes or statements. The orderly life he'd built was officially under assault. But Edward Mahoney had been under assault before, and he'd always emerge victorious. This time would be no different. Chapter 6, The Hunter and the Hunted. 3 days after Charlotte's disappearance, Edward received a package. It arrived via overnight delivery, addressed to him personally with no return address. Josh brought it to his study, where Edward had been working on what he euphemistically called security arrangements for his family. The package was small, roughly the size of a jewelry box, wrapped in brown paper. Dad, Josh said, "Set it on the desk. This came for you." The delivery guy said someone paid cash to have it sent. Edward studied the package without touching it. In his previous life, unexpected packages had been cause for extreme caution. Old habits died hard. "Step back, son. You think it's dangerous?" "I think it's interesting." Edward carefully examined the wrapping, looking for signs of unusual weight distribution or suspicious thickness. After a thorough visual inspection, he used a letter opener to slice through the tape and paper. Inside was a jewelry box, as he'd suspected. Inside the jewelry box was a USB drive and a folded piece of paper. Edward unfolded the paper and read the message written in neat handwriting. "Mr. Mahoney, I thought you might want to see what your wife really thinks of you. Also include our photos she'll probably want back. We should meet. Clay." Edward felt something cold settle in his stomach. He inserted the USB drive into his computer and opened the files it contained. There were dozens of photos, intimate images of Charlotte that left nothing to the imagination, but was the audio files that made Edward's jaw clench. Edward doesn't suspect anything. He's too arrogant to think I'd ever cheat on him. Charlotte's voice, clear and unmistakable. "What about the kids? Won't they ask questions if you keep coming here?" Clay Dillon's voice, smooth and confident. "The kids don't pay attention to what I do." And Edward, "God, Clay, you have no idea what it's like living with someone who thinks he's better than everyone else. He looks at me sometimes like I'm this pathetic little housewife who couldn't survive without him." Edward's hands remained steady as he fast-forwarded through the recordings, but inside, something was being systematically torn apart. The woman on these recordings wasn't the Charlotte who had begged for forgiveness in his study. This was someone who had been mocking him, analyzing his weaknesses, treating their marriage like a prison sentence. "He's so controlling," Charlotte continued in another recording. "Everything has to be perfect. Everything has to be his way. Sometimes I think about what it would be like to just disappear, start over somewhere else with someone who actually appreciates me." "We could do that," Clay's voice suggested. "I know people who could help us disappear. New identities, new life. Your husband would never find us." "Really? You do that for me?" "Baby, I'd do anything for you." Edward stopped the recording and sat back in his chair. Clay Dillon hadn't just been seducing his wife. He'd been recruiting her for some kind of escape plan. The affair wasn't just about sex or blackmail. It was about convincing Charlotte to abandon her family entirely. Josh was watching him carefully. "Dad? What's on there?" "Nothing you need to see," Edward replied, ejecting the USB drive. "But I need you to do something for me. I need you to take your sister and go stay with Uncle Aaron for a few days." "Why?" "Because Clay Dillon is out on bail, and he's trying to provoke me into doing something stupid. I don't want you and Kelly anywhere near this house until it's resolved." Josh's expression hardened in a way that reminded Edward himself at that age. "I'm not running away because some photographer thinks he can intimidate our family." "You're not running away. You're following orders." The military command tone made Josh straighten automatically. "Dad, I can help. I've been training in martial arts since I was 8. And Clay Dillon is a grown man who has already demonstrated that he's willing to destroy people's lives for his own amusement. This isn't a sparring match, son. This is something else entirely." Edward's phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but Edward suspected he knew who it was. "Hello, Clay," he answered. "Edward Mahoney. I was wondering when you'd call me back." Clay's voice was just as smooth in person as it had been on the recordings, with a kind of confident charm that probably worked very well on lonely housewives. But Edward heard something underneath it, a tremor of nervousness that suggested Clay wasn't quite as composed as he wanted to appear. "I got your package," Edward said, very thoughtful. "I thought you might appreciate seeing your wife's true feelings about your marriage. She had some fascinating insights about what it's like to live with someone so controlling." "Where is she?" "Somewhere safe. Somewhere you'll never find her unless I want you to." Edward felt a predatory smile cross his face. "You think you've taken something that belongs to me. Haven't I? Clay, let me explain something to you. Charlotte stopped belonging to me the moment she decided to spread her legs for a small-time photographer who preys on vulnerable women. I don't want her back. There was a pause. Then why did you destroy my life? Because you threatened my family's security. You documented your encounters with my wife, which means you had evidence that could be used to embarrass my children. That's unacceptable. Your children, Clay said, and Edward didn't like the way he said it. They're very attractive kids. Kelly especially. She looks just like her mother. Edward's grip on the phone tightened, but his voice remained calm. What do you want, Clay? I want you to understand that this isn't over. You cost me my business, my reputation, my freedom. I'm going to return the favor. By threatening my children? By taking everything you care about, the same way you took everything I cared about. Edward looked at Josh, who was listening to every word. His son's face had gone pale, but there was anger there too, the cold, controlled anger that Edward recognized as his own legacy. Clay, Edward said quietly, you've made a mistake. What mistake? You've confused me with someone who negotiates with terrorists. Edward hung up and immediately dialed Aaron Bender's number. Aaron, I need you to pick up Josh and Kelly within the hour. Clay Dillon just threatened my children. Jesus, Eddie, I'll be there in 20 minutes. What are you going to do? I'm going to remind Mr. Dillon why threatening a Mahoney is generally considered a career-limiting move. After Aaron arrived and collected a reluctant Josh and Kelly, Edward had the house to himself for the first time since Charlotte's departure. He used the solitude to make preparations that would have been difficult to explain to his children. First, he activated the security system he had installed but never mentioned to his family. Military-grade sensors and cameras that would alert him to any approach to the house. Then he retrieved several items from a gun safe that went well beyond the hunting rifles and handguns that most people expected suburban fathers to own. Finally, he made a series of phone calls to people who owed him favors from his previous life. By evening, he had a complete picture of Clay Dillon's whereabouts, assets, and vulnerabilities. Clay was staying at a luxury hotel in Richmond under a false name, apparently funded by credit cards that belonged to some of his former blackmail victims. He'd been making inquiries about Edward's background, trying to find pressure points he could exploit. Most importantly, he'd been asking about Charlotte's location, suggesting that he didn't actually have her. He'd simply been bluffing to provoke Edward into a reaction. Edward smiled as he loaded magazines and checked equipment. Clay Dillon thought he was playing chess with an amateur. He was about to discover that he'd brought checkers to a knife fight. At midnight, Edward's motion sensors detected movement in the woods behind his house. He watched the security monitors as three figures approached through the trees, moving with a kind of awkward stealth that suggested they'd learned their tactics from movies rather than experience. Clay had brought backup. How considerate. Edward turned off all the lights in the house and settled into a shooting position that covered the back lawn. Through his night vision scope, he could see the three men clearly. Clay Dillon in the center, flanked by two larger men, who were probably hired muscle rather than true professionals. They reached the back door and spent several minutes trying to pick the lock. Edward could have told them they were wasting their time. The door was secured with military-grade hardware that would require explosives to breach, but he was curious to see how far they were willing to go. When the lock-picking failed, one of Clay's companions produced a crowbar and began trying to force the door. Edward decided he'd seen enough. He dialed 911 from his cell phone. 911, what's your emergency? This is Edward Mahoney at 1247, Oak Ridge Road. I have 3 armed intruders attempting to break into my house. I am armed and prepared to defend my property. Sir, please stay on the line. Deputies are en route. I'll do my best, Edward said. But if they breach my house, I'm going to consider that a threat to my life. He hung up and switched to the external speakers he'd had installed as part of the security system. Clay, his voice boomed across the back lawn. You have 30 seconds to leave my property before I start shooting. The 3 figures froze. Edward could see Clay looking around frantically, trying to locate the source of the voice. You want to play games, Edward continued. Let's play. You're trespassing on my property with what appears to be criminal intent. Under Virginia law, I have the right to use deadly force to protect my home and family. Your family isn't even here. Clay shouted back. No, they're not, which means there are no innocent bystanders to worry about. Edward could hear sirens in the distance. Clay apparently heard them too, because he grabbed his companions and started running toward the woods. Edward tracked them through a scope, but didn't fire. He didn't need to. The police would find them before they reached their vehicle. As the sirens grew louder, Edward allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Clay Dillon had just escalated this conflict to a level where Edward held every advantage. The photographer was about to learn the difference between manipulating vulnerable women and threatening a man who had built his life around neutralizing threats. The war Clay had wanted was about to begin, but it would be a very short war, and there would be only one survivor. Chapter 7: Precision Strikes. The arrest of Clay Dillon and his two associates made the morning news, complete with footage of them being led away in handcuffs from the woods behind Edward's property. The reporter described it as a bizarre escalation in the ongoing scandal, noting that Dillon was now facing charges of breaking and entering, criminal trespass, and violation of his bail conditions. Edward watched the coverage from Aaron Bender's house, where Josh and Kelly were still staying for their own safety. His children sat on either side of him on the couch, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock and admiration at how efficiently their father had dealt with threat. "So he's going back to jail?" Kelly asked. "He's going back to jail," Edward confirmed. "And this time he won't be getting bail." "What happens now?" Josh wanted to know. Edward considered the question. Clay Dillon was neutralized, at least temporarily, but that didn't resolve the larger problems facing his family. Charlotte was still missing, though Aaron's sources suggested she was hiding somewhere in North Carolina, using her maiden name. The media was still camped outside their house, and the scandal would continue to follow them until something more interesting came along to capture public attention. More importantly, Edward had used Clay's attack as an opportunity to send a message to anyone else who might be tempted to threaten his family. Word would spread through certain circles that Edward Mahoney was not someone to be trifled with, that the suburban father facade concealed someone much more dangerous. "Now we rebuild," Edward said. "We figure out how to move forward without your mother." Kelly looked uncomfortable. "Dad, have you heard from her at all? I mean, I know she messed up, but she's still our mom." Edward had been expecting this conversation. Despite everything Charlotte had done, despite the recordings where she'd mocked their marriage and discussed abandoning their family, his children still loved their mother. That love would complicate their healing, but it was also evidence of their fundamental decency. "I haven't heard from her directly," Edward said carefully, "but I know she's safe. Could we maybe try to contact her? Just to talk?" Edward studied his daughter's face, seeing Charlotte's features there, but hoping for his own strength. "Kelly, what would you say to her?" "I don't know. That I miss her? That I want to understand why she did this. And if she told you that she left because she was unhappy in our family? That she found someone who made her feel more alive than we ever did? What then?" Kelly's eyes filled with tears. I guess I want to know if there was anything we could have done differently." "There wasn't," Edward said firmly. "Your mother made a choice to have an affair. She made another choice to abandon her family rather than fight for it. Those were her decisions, not ours." Josh was studying his father with the analytical expression Edward recognized as his own. "Dad, are you ever going to forgive her?" "No." The finality of the word seemed to echo in the room. Edward saw his children exchange glances, processing this new reality. But what if she comes back and apologizes? Kelly pressed. What if she wants to try to make things right? Then she'll discover that some things can be fixed with apologies. Aaron emerged from his kitchen carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd been listening to a conversation he wished he could avoid. "Kids, why don't you go check on my horses? I need to talk to your father for a minute." After Josh and Kelly had gone outside, Aaron settled into his recliner and studied Edward with the familiarity of 20 years of friendship. "You're scaring them," Aaron said. "They should be scared. Their mother betrayed them in the worst possible way, and now they're trying to find ways to excuse it because they can't process the reality. Eddie, they're kids. They love their mother. Their mother stopped deserving that love the moment she decided to mock them to her lover." Aaron was quiet for a moment. "You know, For someone who just successfully defended his family against a genuine threat, you don't seem very satisfied. Edward considered that observation. Aaron was right. He should have felt some sense of completion now that Clay Dillon was in custody and his family was safe. Instead, he felt hollow, like he'd won a battle in a war that couldn't truly be won. Clay Dillon was never the real problem, Edward said finally. He was just a symptom. Meaning the real problem was that my wife was capable of betraying our family in the first place. Destroying Clay doesn't change that. So what would change it? Edward didn't have an answer for that question, and Aaron seemed to recognize his silence as an admission of something deeper. Eddie, you can't control whether people betray you. You can only control how you respond when they do. I'm responding. You're retaliating. There's a difference. Before Edward could reply, his phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but something about the area code made him answer. Hello, Edward. Charlotte's voice was small, uncertain. It's me. Edward felt his children's presence before he saw them. They'd come back inside and were standing in the doorway, their eyes wide at hearing their mother's voice through the phone speaker. Charlotte. Edward's voice was neutral, giving nothing away. I saw the news about Clay. Are you and the kids okay? We're fine. Clay Dillon is in jail where he belongs. There was a long pause. Edward, I need to see you. We need to talk. We have nothing to talk about. Please. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking for one conversation. Just you and me face to face. Edward looked at his children, saw the hope and pain warring in their expressions. They wanted him to say yes, wanted to believe that their family could somehow be repaired. Where are you? He asked. Asheville. I can meet you anywhere you want, anytime you want. Edward calculated distances and drive times. Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock, the Marriott in downtown Richmond. Come alone. Edward, thank you. I know this doesn't fix anything, but... Charlotte, Edward interrupted, I'm not meeting you to reconcile. I'm meeting you to make sure you understand that this is over. He hung up before she could respond. When he looked up, Kelly was crying again. Dad, maybe this is a chance for me to make your mother understand that her choices have consequences, Edward said. Nothing more. But as he watched his children struggle with the complicated emotions their mother's call had triggered, Edward wondered if he was making the right decision. Was he protecting his family by refusing to forgive Charlotte, or was he perpetuating their pain by keeping the wound open? The answer, he realized, didn't matter. Edward Mahoney had never been a man who second-guessed his decisions once they were made. Charlotte had betrayed their family, and now she would live with the consequences of that betrayal. Tomorrow night, he would make sure she understood that those consequences were permanent. Chapter 8. The Final Verdict. The Marriott's lobby was nearly empty at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. Edward arrived 15 minutes early and positioned himself at a table that gave him clear sightlines to all entrances while keeping his back to a wall. Old habits from a life that officially didn't exist, but habits that had kept him alive when it mattered. He dressed carefully for this meeting, a charcoal gray suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, a black shirt that made his gray eyes look like winter storms. He wanted Charlotte to see the man she'd lost, not the suburban father she'd taken for granted. Charlotte appeared at exactly 7 o'clock, and Edward felt a flicker of something that might have been pride at her punctuality. She'd always been precise about time, one of the many small traits that had initially attracted him to her. She spotted him immediately and walked over with the kind of careful composure that suggested she'd been rehearsing this moment. She looked older, Edward noted with clinical detachment. The stress of the past week had carved lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, and her usual perfect posture had been replaced by something more fragile. She was still beautiful. That hadn't changed. But she was no longer the confident woman who had ruled their social circle with effortless grace. Edward, she said, settling into the chair across from him. Charlotte. They studied each other across the small table, like opponents sizing up their chances. Edward saw Charlotte's eyes taking his suit, his posture, the way he'd chosen this meeting place to emphasize that he held all the power in this conversation. You look good, she said finally. You look tired. Charlotte's laugh was hollow. I haven't been sleeping well. It's been a difficult week. I imagine it has. A waitress approached their table, and Charlotte ordered wine, while Edward stuck with coffee. They waited in silence until the drinks arrived, both of them apparently reluctant to begin a conversation that could only end badly. How are Josh and Kelly? Charlotte asked finally. They're processing their mother's abandonment. It's taking time. I didn't abandon them, Charlotte said sharply. You forced me out. I gave you a choice. You chose to run rather than fight for your family. What kind of choice was that? Stay and be arrested, or leave and maybe preserve some dignity for kids? Edward leaned back in his chair, his expression unchanged. The kind of choice that reveals character. You chose self-preservation over your children. Charlotte's composure cracked slightly. That's not fair, and you know it. What's not fair is 15 years of marriage destroyed because you decided to fuck a photographer who specializes in seducing married women. The crude language made Charlotte flinch. Edward had never spoken to her that way before, had always maintained a careful courtesy that came with his military background. But tonight was about clarity, not courtesy. I made a mistake, Charlotte said quietly. I know that. I'll regret it for the rest of my life. Mistakes are when you forget to pay a bill or burn dinner. What you did was a series of calculated decisions to betray your family. I fell in love. You fell for a con man who was documenting your encounters and using them to extort money from you. That's not love, Charlotte. That's stupidity. Charlotte's face went white. How did you? The recordings he had, did you hear them? All of them. Edward watched his wife process this revelation, saw the moment she realized that he'd heard her mocking their marriage, discussing plans to abandon their children, treating their 15 years together like a prison sentence she was desperate to escape. Edward, those recordings. I was angry and hurt, and I said things I didn't mean. Which things didn't you mean? When you call me controlling and arrogant, when you said the kids didn't pay attention to what you did, when you discussed disappearing with Clay and starting a new life somewhere I'd never find you. Each question hit Charlotte like a physical blow. She gripped her wine glass with both hands, knuckles white against the dark red liquid. I was confused, she whispered. Clay made me feel things I hadn't felt in years, and I thought maybe that meant our marriage was over. But I never would have actually left the kids. You did leave the kids. Because you gave me an impossible choice. I gave you the same choice I give any enemy who threatened my family. Surrender or face the consequences. The word enemy hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Charlotte stared at Edward, and for the first time, she seemed to understand totality of what she'd lost. Enemy, she repeated. Is that what I am to you now? You betrayed my children, Edward said simply. That makes you whatever I decide you are. Charlotte set down her wine glass and leaned forward, her voice taking on the desperate edge of someone making a final argument before a hostile jury. Edward, I know I hurt you. I know I made terrible mistakes. But I'm the mother of your children. Doesn't that count for something? Can't we find some way to? No. The finality of the word stopped her mid-sentence. I don't want you back, Charlotte. I don't want to try again. I don't want counseling or second chances, or any of the other things people say when they're trying to fix something that's permanently broken. But the kids will be fine. They're stronger than you think they are, and they'll learn to be stronger without you. You can't just cut me out of their lives forever. Edward's smile was the coldest thing Charlotte had ever seen. Watch me. They'll resent you for keeping us apart. They'll understand that actions have consequences. It's a lesson their mother never learned. Charlotte stared at him for a long moment, then reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. I wrote them letters, she said, placing it on the table between them. Would you at least give them these? Edward didn't touch the envelope. What do they say? That I love them, that I'm sorry, that this isn't their fault, and that you chose Clay Dillon over their father. I didn't choose Clay over you. I chose myself over a marriage that was making me feel invisible. Same thing. Charlotte pushed the envelope toward him across the table. Please, Edward. They deserve to hear from me in my own words. Edward picked up the envelope and, without opening it, tore it in half. Then he tore it in half again, dropping the pieces into the ashtray at the center of their table. "Your words are what got us into this situation," he said. "My children don't need to hear any more of them." Charlotte watched the pieces of her letters settle into the ashtray like confetti at a funeral. When she looked up at Edward again, her eyes were filled with a grief so profound it might have moved him once. But that was before he'd heard her recordings, before he'd understood the depth of her contempt for the life they'd built together. "I loved you," she said. "I know you don't believe that now, but I did love you. You loved the security I provided. You loved the lifestyle, the house, the social status. You never loved me. That's not true. Prove it." Charlotte stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find words that didn't exist. "You can't," Edward continued, "because if you had loved me, you never could have done what you did. Love doesn't mock the person it claims to cherish. Love doesn't plan elaborate betrayals. Love doesn't abandon children because facing consequences is inconvenient." Edward stood up and placed a $20 bill on the table to cover their drinks. "This is goodbye, Charlotte. Don't contact me again. Don't try to reach the children. Move on with your life and let us move on with ours." "Edward, wait." But Edward was already walking away, leaving Charlotte alone at the table with her wine and her regrets. He didn't look back, didn't pause, didn't give her any reason to hope that this conversation had changed anything. Outside in the parking lot, Edward sat in his car for several minutes, allowing himself to process what had just happened. He'd seen Charlotte McKinney for what might be the last time, had formally ended their marriage with a kind of finality that left no room for doubt or hope. He should have felt something: anger, sadness, relief, regret. Instead, he felt empty, like he'd just completed a necessary but unpleasant task. His phone buzzed with text from Josh. "How did it go?" Edward stared at the message for a moment, then typed back, "It's over," as he drove home through the Virginia countryside. Edward thought about his children and the life they would build together without Charlotte. It would be different from what they'd planned, smaller and perhaps lonelier, but it would be honest in a way their previous life had never been. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of rebuilding their family around the people who had chosen to stay. Tonight, he was finally free to close the door on the woman who had chosen to leave. Charlotte McKinney Mahoney was history. Now it was time to focus on the future. Chapter 9, New Foundations. 6 months later, Edward stood on his porch watching the sunrise paint the Virginia countryside in familiar shades of gold and amber. The reporters were long gone. The scandal had faded from public memory, and life had settled into a new rhythm that felt both foreign and surprisingly comfortable. Josh had graduated high school as valedictorian and was heading to VMI in the fall, following in his father's military footsteps. Kelly had transferred to a university close at home, officially citing academic considerations, but really because she wasn't ready to leave her father alone yet. Neither of his children had mentioned their mother in weeks. The house felt different now. Quieter, more masculine, stripped of the decorative touches that had been Charlotte's domain. Edward had remodeled the master bedroom, turning it into something that belonged entirely to him. The guest room had become a proper armory, while Charlotte's former office was now a computer center where Edward managed his expanding security consulting business. Aaron Bender emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, a morning ritual they'd established since Aaron had effectively become Edward's business partner. The private investigation firm was thriving, with clients ranging from suspicious spouses to Fortune 500 companies needing background checks on potential executives. "Anything interesting overnight?" Aaron asked, settling into the chair beside Edward's. Clay Dillon was sentenced yesterday. 7 years for the blackmail charges, plus additional time for violating his bail conditions. He'll be eligible for parole in 4 years if he behaves himself. Think he learned his lesson? Edward's smile was thin and cold. Clay Dillon learned that there are consequences for threatening my family. Whether he learned anything else is irrelevant. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the horses graze in the distant pasture. Edward had sold most of Charlotte's horses, keeping only the ones that Josh and Kelly had personal attachments to. The stables were quieter now, but also more peaceful. "Eddie," Aaron said eventually, "I got a call yesterday from someone you might find interesting." "Oh." "Vernon Hoover." Remember him? Edward did remember Vernon Hoover, a fellow operative who had specialized in psychological warfare and had earned a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in pursuit of objectives. If Vernon was calling, it meant someone wanted Edward's services for something that went beyond standard security consulting. What does Vernon want? He's working for a consortium of wealthy families who have a problem with predators targeting their wives and daughters. They've heard about what happened with Clay Dillon, and they want to retain your services as a consultant. Edward considered this development. The idea of hunting predators who targeted vulnerable women held considerable appeal, especially given his recent experiences. It would be a way to channel his skills towards something constructive while building the kind of reputation that would ensure his family's security for years to come. What kind of consulting? The kind where problems disappear permanently. Legal problems? Eventually, Edward felt something stir in his chest that he recognized as anticipation. For months, he'd been focused on rebuilding his family life, but the truth was that he missed the hunt. He missed the satisfaction of neutralizing threats and protecting the innocent. "I'll think about it," Edward said. "Think fast. Vernon wants an answer by the end of the week." After Aaron left for his office in Richmond, Edward found himself alone with his thoughts and his coffee. Josh was still sleeping, and Kelly wouldn't be up for another hour. The solitude gave him time to reflect on how dramatically his life had changed. A year ago, he'd been a suburban father with a seemingly perfect marriage and a quiet consulting business. Now, he was a single father with a damaged family and a reputation for being someone you didn't cross. The transformation had been painful but necessary, like setting a badly healed bone so it could heal properly. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Edward's first instinct was wariness. Unknown numbers had been a prelude to threats in the past. But this message was different. "Mr. Mahoney, this is Detective Sarah Patterson with the Richmond PD. We had a development in the Charlotte Mahoney missing person case. Could you call me when convenient?" Edward stared at the message for a long moment. Charlotte had been officially classified as a missing person after she'd stopped using her credit cards, and her cell phone had gone silent 3 weeks after their meeting at the Marriott. Edward had told the police that his wife had left voluntarily after their marriage ended, but they'd opened an investigation anyway. He dialed Detective Patterson's number. "Detective Patterson, this is Edward Mahoney. You sent me a text about my wife's case." "Mr. Mahoney, thank you for calling. We found your wife's car this morning in a long-term parking garage at Reagan National Airport. It appears to have been there for several months." Edward felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Any sign of Charlotte?" "No, sir, but we did find some items in the car that suggest she may have been planning to leave the country. We also found evidence that she wasn't alone when she abandoned the vehicle." "What kind of evidence?" "Security footage shows her walking away from the car with a man who matches the description of Clay Dillon. This was 3 days before Mr. Dillon's arrest at your property." Edward processed this information carefully. If Charlotte had been with Clay when he'd abandoned her car at the airport, it meant they'd been planning to disappear together. But Clay had been arrested, which meant Charlotte had been left stranded without resources or a plan. "Detective, are you suggesting that my wife might be in danger?" "We're exploring all possibilities, Mr. Mahoney. But given Mr. Dillon's history and the circumstances of your wife's disappearance, we're concerned that she may have become a victim of the man she thought was helping her." After Edward hung up, he stood on his porch for a long time, thinking about the implications of what Detective Patterson had told him. If Charlotte was dead, if Clay Dillon had killed her either before or after their failed escape attempt, then Edward was responsible. Not legally, perhaps, but morally. He'd orchestrated Clay's downfall knowing that the man was dangerous, knowing that Charlotte was vulnerable, knowing that desperate people do desperate things. The question was whether he cared. Edward searched his feelings for some trace of guilt or regret, some indication that he mourned the possible loss of the woman who had been his wife for 15 years. But all he found was a cold satisfaction that justice had been served, one way or another. Charlotte had chosen to betray her family. Clay Dillon had chosen to prey on vulnerable women. If those choices had led to consequences neither of them had anticipated, that was unfortunate, but not Edward's responsibility. "Dad!" Kelly's voice came from behind him. Everything okay? You look like you're planning someone's funeral again. Edward turned to smile at his daughter, who was wearing one of his old military t-shirts and had her blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked young and innocent and absolutely nothing like the woman who had given birth to her. Just thinking about the future, Edward said, "There might be some changes coming." Good changes or bad changes? That depends on your perspective. Kelly studied his face with the intuitive understanding that came from being his daughter. You're going to take Vernon's job, aren't you? Edward wasn't surprised that she'd overheard his conversation with Aaron. Kelly had always been observant, and the house wasn't that large. I'm considering it. Will it be dangerous? Everything worthwhile is dangerous. Kelly nodded like this made perfect sense to her, which Edward supposed it did. She was his daughter. After all, raised understand that strength and principle sometimes require difficult choices. Just promise me something, Kelly said. What's that? Promise me that whoever you're hunting deserves it. Edward looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw a strength there that had been forged in the fires of betrayal and abandonment. She was 19 years old, but her eyes held the kind of wisdom that came from surviving the destruction of everything she thought was permanent. They'll deserve it, Edward promised. As the sun climbed higher in the Virginia sky, Edward Mahoney stood on his porch and contemplated the future. His wife was probably dead, killed by the same man she planned to disappear with. His family was smaller but stronger, tempered by betrayal into something unbreakable. His reputation was growing in circles that specialized in solving problems that couldn't be solved through conventional means. It wasn't a life he'd planned, but it was a life he'd earned through his choices and the choices of those around him. And unlike the life he'd lost, this one was built on a foundation of truth rather than comfortable lies. Edward Mahoney had been betrayed, abandoned, and tested. He had emerged from that crucible as something harder and more dangerous than the suburban father he'd once been. Now it was time to put those skills to work. The hunt was about to begin.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.